arrived in Perth, and it was a difficult situation. What to do? Is that, is Prabhupada going to stay in a motel, a hotel, with meat eaters, or at Ganesha's house, which is really unsuitable? So we rented a house for 6 months for Prabhupada to stay in for 10 days. Just something you do, for your beloved Guru. I'd also met Prabhupada previously, but this is one of the highlights. So Prabhupada arrived and we just got the house together. You can imagine we had to borrow beds, borrow sheets, borrow towels, cooking utensils, buy food. So Prabhupada arrived and he really liked the break there. He was with 5 devotees and we were just in a house. And so Shruti Kitty cooked a lovely feast, and on the first day we served Prabhupada lunch, and then we had lunch. And of course, we had been on the road for about 3 or 4 days organising. We hadn't slept and we hadn't eaten properly. So when we had sumptuous prasad cooked with love for Prabhupada, we passed out. I seem to have passed out more than anybody else. So I'm in the middle of the day, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm totally passed out on the floor. Didn't know who I was, where I was. And then there was a bell ringing, and it was ringing and ringing. Everyone else woke up and they left me there. So then I woke up, and I was excited because I was in the same house as Srila Prabhupada, and I looked to my side and I could see feet and I could see a cane. And I looked up and I looked up and I looked up, and there was Prabhupada looking down at me. And he said simply, "Irresponsible Prince. Devotees work hard and you simply eat and sleep. Krishna sends and you exploit. The irresponsible prince enjoys all the facility and sleeps all day. This is just unacceptable." He said to me, "You can leave this movement, you can go. This movement doesn't need you. It doesn't need devotees like you. It doesn't need irresponsible prince." And he left and went to his room. And so I sat on the floor for a few minutes wondering what to do. And so I went into Prabhupada's room after a conversation with Shruti Kitty, and just offered my dandavats, and Prabhupada said, "So, don't be irresponsible, Prince." And I can't remember, I don't think I said sorry, but I just, Prabhupada could see that I was devastated. I was tossed out. I was temple president of Sydney, manager of Spiritual Sky, and in charge of this expedition. And so I was totally, devastated indeed. And he said, we don't need irresponsible prince. To enjoy, or Krishna sends and you simply enjoy. Well, the next day I downed a wig and I went through Perth opening up incense accounts while we were there. So when I got back in the afternoon for lunch, Shruti Kirti told Prabhupada his Jayadharma has been out selling incense. And he said, "Jay, Jay. So that was good, and that I wasn't, but it was quite an experience. You can imagine Prabhupada saying, this movement doesn't need you. So Prabhupada didn't like devotees to exploit the resources sent by Krishna. So then we flew across to Melbourne, and Prabhupada was opening the Melbourne temple. But if I can just digress a little bit, it seemed to be kind of my relationship with Prabhupada. Because when I was in Sydney earlier, I had become a little proud. But I'll even digress a bit further, is that we were doing Sankirtan in the very early days, about 1971, 72, and the authorities were putting us into jail. So Madhavisa Maharaj had written to Prabhupada, and he'd written to Prabhupada, Prabhupada, we need to borrow money. And if we could only raise some money, we would get legal representation, and we would beat the police and the council. We would beat them. Prabhupada wrote back and said, no need of lawyer, no need of legal counsel, just chant Hare Krishna and go to jail. He said, you can chant in the temple, you can chant in the street, and you can chant in jail. Just chant. And so Madhavisa, who was very beloved devotee in GBC of Australia, he gave us the message. Chant in the temple, chant in the street, chant in jail. So everybody would go on Sankirtan, even the spiritual sky people. And so we were getting thousands of summons, and there was a big court case, and the police would arrive at the temple and they'd have 200 summonses, and whoever answered the door would say, they're not here, they're not here, they're not here. Anyway, there was a big court case, and we didn't go. We didn't even go, because Prabhupada said, just chant. So it was front page of the newspapers. Hare Krishna's sanctioned by court to chant on the street. So in other words, it went to court, and we didn't even represent ourselves, and it came up that that the judge said, you can't stop them from chanting, but there's one thing I will say, is they must keep moving. They can't congest the streets. So therefore it was past the court. So Prabhupada arrived in Glebe, and we had a little abode for him next to the temple, which we just acquired, because we could rent more now because we had more money. And Madhavisa Maharaj introduced me to Prabhupada as the head of Spiritual Sky and the head of the business of the temple, and very successful. And he's got thousands of dollars, and here's a check for $20,000. And Prabhupada looked at me, and he looked at the check, and he handed it to his secretary. And I said to Srila Prabhupada, Prabhupada, I have a gift for you, some sandalwood oil. And I pushed it across to him, and he opened it up, and he said, so you're the head of our Spiritual Sky, and you don't even know good sandalwood oil. He said, he pushed the oil back to me, he said, you don't even know a pure oil, and you're head of our business section. It seemed to be my Leela. And I said, yes, Prabhupada, I guess I don't know a pure oil. And he said, well, go. Prabhupada just instructed, he was just flabbergasted that such a person as useless as myself was in charge of the fragrance company of the movement. So when we're flying back from Perth, we flew in the same aeroplane as Prabhupada, which was really blissful. And so I had a chance to have a bit of a yarn to Prabhupada, just myself and Srila Prabhupada. And I had a terrible stutter in those days. I used to stutter quite a bit when I was younger, just due to nerves and trauma or whatever. And so I was sitting next to Prabhupada at the airport, because Prabhupada always liked to get early. And I said to Prabhupada, Prabhupada, the devotees in the temple, if you chant with these fingers, they say no, these fingers, that finger, these fingers. Which fingers should you chant with? And Prabhupada looked at me, and I'm holding up all my fingers, and he said to me, just chant, just chant. At that time I felt very foolish, but it showed Prabhupada's merciful glance, is that just chant. So then I realised if you had no hands, you might have to chant with your feet. But somehow or other, just chant. Just chant. Just don't get too much into the technicalities of it all. So we flew through to Melbourne, which was spectacular. Prabhupada loved the samosas on the aeroplane. He ate many samosas, and I was lucky enough to eat the remnants. But the most spectacular feeling was when we reached Melbourne and the door of the aeroplane opened and you could hear the chanting waft into the aeroplane. And there was 100 or 200 devotees waiting there in the lounge to receive Prabhupada. And there was tumultuous, joyous chanting. And it was absolutely a spontaneous, beautiful occasion, and just heart-wrenching to walk through that and see the devotees welcome Prabhupada with such gusto and enthusiasm. And then we went down to the press where Prabhupada was being welcomed by the press of Australia. And so a funny thing happened. Is we'd rented a Rolls Royce for Srila Prabhupada, or a Bentley, and which was a big thing in Australia, and actually it had got a parking ticket. They'd given it a parking ticket, because of course the devotees parked it right, in the most conspicuous position. And the press cottoned on to that, and they said, Swami, you're a spiritual man. Prabhupada looked over and said, but you're not materialist. Prabhupada looked, and they said, but your followers have got you a Rolls Royce. And Prabhupada turned and said, I'm a man of God. Bring me car of diamonds. What is this tinny Rolls Royce? In the uproar of devotees. Some of this might be on video, but it was a tremendous moment, the uproar of all the devotees and the smile on the... So the newspapers in Australia at that time said, Swami says, bring me car made of diamonds. Which just showed how Prabhupada was in an inconceivable space that no one could fathom his wonderful answers. And in the Ratha Yatra, Prabhupada was walking along, as Prabhupada always did, very humble yet firmly fixed in the absolute truth. So during the festival, there was a huge crowd around Prabhupada. And we had 3 huge Ratha Yatra carts. Madhavisa never did anything in a small way for Srila Prabhupada. The Melbourne temple was spectacular. Prabhupada loved it. And the 100-year-old monk's house or priest's house was all done up to perfection. So Prabhupada's walking in the Ratha Yatra and there's a huge crowd, and there's 3 or 4, there's a lot of suspicious looking ruffians around Prabhupada, and they're closing in. And I was playing mridanga, and Madhavisa was playing kartals, a few other devotees were playing mridanga. So Madhavisa, as he was dancing in a circle, and as he was twirling, he was kicking, kicking these people, kicking them quite hard and quite firmly to say, get back from Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada just kept on walking, total faith in Prabhupada. I'm seeing Madhavisa, almost brutally, just giving them a firm kick to say, don't come anywhere near His Divine Grace. And His Divine Grace is, how he would float. Not walk, just kind of float along in this huge crowd. It was a massive crowd in the main street of. So then there's a huge lecture at Melbourne Town Hall. Quite a good crowd. And actually, my mother was there. She still remembers today. And so the devotees had made a fan. And I always liked to fan Prabhupada in Vrindavan or, wherever I could. I was always first to grab a fan and get by the Vyasasana and fan Srila Prabhupada. But the devotees in their artistic fever had got a piece of chipboard. You know how heavy chipboard is, don't you? It's really heavy. Kilos. And they'd about so big. And they'd put a huge pole on it and they'd stuck peacock feathers on it. So I picked up that fan and I started to fan Prabhupada. And somehow or other the air conditioning in the place didn't work and it was really hot. Some say it was sabotaged by the City Council because Madhavisa rented the Melbourne Town Hall. And it was a good crowd too. And he was a great preacher, Madhavisa. And so I was fanning Prabhupada. This is after Perth. This is after the don't know sandalwood oil. I'm fanning Prabhupada. And Prabhupada's playing the lecture. He's giving the lecture. It's a fabulous lecture. Fabulous lecture. Every lecture of Prabhupada was fabulous. And he's saying that if you want knowledge, don't just stick your head in the ocean to find out how many fish there are. You might find a shark or a crocodile, but go to the Vedas. And the Vedas tell you there's 900,000 species within the water. If you want knowledge, go to the Vedas. Well, I'm fanning Prabhupada. I'm starting to ache. It was a huge kirtan. Huge kirtan. Prabhupada speaking for 56 minutes. Every bone in my body is aching. My head is aching. My wrists are aching. My legs are aching. I'm just about ready to collapse. I'm trying to nod to all the devotees who are just like either asleep because they haven't slept for a week, or in ecstasy, or both. I'm nodding. Please, somebody perceive what's going on, will you? Somebody come and I just can't get anyone's attention. So I stop fanning. Prabhupada stops the lecture and looks at me. And says, fan. And it would have been the greatest moment of my life because I just picked up the fan and I fanned for the rest of the lecture and the rest of a big kirtan. And it was just where you just forgot, all your pain. And in the years of service, there was no shortage of it, of pain, which, if you really take a good look at it, could even be pleasure. So it was a transcendental moment. The lecture's going on after that, and I'm fanning Prabhupada during question time. So there was a guy in Melbourne called the Wizard, and he grabs the microphone and he starts yelling at Prabhupada. So, he says, show me God. Prabhupada says, have you got the eyes to see God? And he yells out, I am God. Prabhupada says, God is all beautiful. Are you all beautiful? And the man says, yes, and the entire audience bursts into laughter. Prabhupada says, God is all rich. Are you all rich? And he says, yes. Oh, he's a vagabond. He lives in the street. Everybody laughs. Prabhupada says, God is all strong. If I kick you in the face, will you defend? And at that point, two devotees picked up the Wizard and gently took him from the theatre. So after the lecture, a number of people came to me and they showed their anger. And they said, who is he to say to you, fan me, fan me, fan me? I had about a dozen people around me. And then my mother, she butted in and said, it's good for him, it's good for him. He needs it, he needs it. And I said, well, if you take a spiritual teacher, you are accepting an authority. You have analysed a person to have knowledge. You have analysed a person to be detached from the world. You have analysed a person with all good qualities, and you're learning from that person. And so that's the thing. If you accept a teacher, you have to be ready to take instructions. So that was kind of wonderful, and my mother still today adores Srila Prabhupada. I was on a morning walk in Perth, which has been recorded on audio, but Ganesh did say to Prabhupada, you know, at one stage, maybe we could force people to become Krishna conscious. And Prabhupada said that's not possible because you can't force love. So love must be spontaneous. But there was an interesting moment which I don't think is captured on audio with Prabhupada walking in the beach in Perth, is because I've only been able to track down a few. But Prabhupada all of a sudden mentioned a funny thing. He mentioned that he had a godbrother who was 92, and that godbrother had married a young girl under 21. And Prabhupada was just mentioning it, and he was laughing in a very kind of childish way. It was very interesting it's hard to describe the laugh. But I always thought, gee, that's really interesting. That, you know, Prabhupada thinks it's funny in a very innocent way that his godbrother, 92, you know, has married a girl under 21. But that was just interesting, you know, to hear that little laugh and of Prabhupada on a morning walk. A question I did ask Srila Prabhupada, which I don't think is recorded. I said to Prabhupada, I joined this Krishna conscious movement, Srila Prabhupada, because you said, chant and be happy. But I can't say that I'm really happy. You know, because Shruti Kirti was quite often asking Prabhupada's questions, and as we say in Australia, he was throwing the cat amongst the pigeons. So I thought, well, you know, there's hardship, you know what I mean? It's not all peaches and cream, it's not all be happy. So I said to Prabhupada, I'm not really absolutely happy, Prabhupada. And I just was inquisitive to see what Prabhupada would say back. Because Prabhupada was also, even though he was like a thunderbolt, he was also like a rose. And I just thought, well, okay, Prabhupada, I've had quite a bit of the thunderbolt. I'll check out the rose. And Srila Prabhupada, he said, well, if you didn't chant, you would be more unhappy. He says, your happiness must have keep working, And that satisfied me, really, is that if you didn't chant, you'd be most unhappy. And of course, now in my life, 50 years later, I realise that's true. Because the people that I'm meeting as an Ayurvedic practitioner, you could safely say no one finds true happiness in this material world through the elements, bhumi apana, through earth, water, fire, air and space, mind, intelligence and ego, the two inferior energies. People are not finding happiness in these places unless you chant Hare Krishna and come to the spiritual plane. And there was one letter I did receive from Srila Prabhupada, and I recommended a few devotees for initiation. They're still wonderful devotees, and the letter said that you give them initiation and perform a fire sacrifice, chant Hare Krishna, and you become a guru. That's what the letter said. So I can understand from that what Prabhupada's instructions, that, to just follow the path of the Mahajans, and in that way, on whatever level, sincere level you're at, you could be a guru yourself, on not necessarily Uttama Adhikari, but... And there was one letter I got the other day from the Prabhupada archives, but there was a few Jayadharmas. Have you met other Jayadharmas? Oh, there was another Jayadharma, but there's one letter that Srila Prabhupada got, and he returned the reply to Jayadharma, and I'm just trying to remember if it was myself, because and it was a letter complaining about the GBC.
Prabhupada or the Jayadharma?
No, from the Jayadharma. It could have been me, actually. It could have been me, because we did have, incredible stories and upheavals, which, I think every body experienced, over the years, in the material world. But, the essence is, of course, learning from these experiences. It's like medicine, being an Ayurvedic practitioner. Medicine takes extremely bad, quite often. But if you know the qualities of that medicine, then your mind may even perceive it in a different way and know the good effects of the karma of that medicine. So it's like devotional service is a wonderful medicine. And if you take it without becoming a victim of the tricks of the mind, well, then you'll make advancement despite all the troubles, all the troubles that you face, and in the process. I think these are all a test of faith, actually, not belief, but trust in the sublime. Belief is a different story. Belief is more on the emotional. Trust in the sublime is more philosophical, more on the spiritual plane. So, because we can see the sublime everywhere, and especially Prabhupada came to teach us of the sublime. And that was his. So all the lessons, whether good or bad, are certainly transcendental. Prabhupada's overall quality of being fixed, a mixture of inconceivable mixture. If I could, being an Ayurvedic doctor, I would compare Srila Prabhupada to the perfect yogas or formulas made by, 600 BC, formulated by the greats of Ayurveda, Sushruta, Charaka and Vagbhat. In those formulas, you can't really pick the qualities, like in a sense, because all the qualities are so masterfully balanced. Like you've got formulas that are cooling with an after warming effect, with a beginning bitter taste, with an after sweet taste. So I would compare Srila Prabhupada to inconceivable mixture of transcendental qualities that can't be described by the words good or bad, hot or cold, happy, distressed. Just always transcendental, like above the mundane. Always you could trust that Srila Prabhupada would always be fixed in the absolute truth. Nitya, always. Always to give you relief. Samsara dava nadalita loka. The spiritual master extinguishes the blazing fire of material existence with the rain of Krishna's mercy or the torchlight of knowledge. Amaganatimanandasya. So that's the quality of Prabhupada. And this material words of duality are just not enough to describe a transcendental personality. Jai Anilo Prem